February 20th, 1944. A young American pilot named Lieutenant James Howard sits in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang at an airfield in England, staring at a map spread across his knees. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from cold. The temperature inside the unheated aircraft is below freezing. He's looking at a red line drawn from his base to a city deep inside Germany, Berlin, 580 miles away. The mission briefing officer had said it with complete confidence. "You will escort the bombers all the way to the target and back." Howard had raised his hand. "Sir, that's impossible. We don't have the range." The officer smiled. "You do now." Sitting beside Howard's aircraft are two large teardrop-shaped metal tanks, each holding 75 gallons of fuel. Drop tanks. They're bolted under his wings, ugly and awkward, but they change everything. With these tanks, the impossible becomes possible. A single-engine fighter can fly from England to Berlin and back. But Howard doesn't know if it will actually work. Nobody does. This has never been tried before. Across the English Channel, in a bunker beneath Berlin, a German general named Adolf Galland is about to receive news that will change the course of the war. He doesn't know it yet. Right now, he's drinking coffee and reviewing defensive positions, confident that his interceptors control the skies over Germany. In less than 2 weeks, that confidence will be shattered, and the war in the air will be lost. This is the story of March 6, 1944. The day a silver American fighter appeared over Berlin and ended German air superiority forever. To understand what happened on March 6th, you need to understand the problem that had plagued Allied air commanders since 1942. The problem was simple: range. American B-17 flying fortresses could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs deep into Germany, but they were slow, flying at barely 180 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Their only defense was their guns, 13.50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, operated by 10 crew members who froze in the unpressurized fuselages as temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The bombers flew in tight formations called combat boxes, dozens of aircraft clustered together, so their defensive fire would create an overlapping field of death for any attacking fighter. In theory, this made them nearly invincible. In practice, it made them sitting ducks. German fighters, primarily the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, were faster, more maneuverable, and heavily armed. A single FW 190 carried 4 20mm cannons that could tear a B-17 apart in seconds. And German pilots had developed tactics specifically designed to break up bomber formations. They would attack from head-on, diving out of the sun at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, firing short, devastating bursts, then breaking away before the bomber gunners could track them. Once the formation was scattered, they would pick off stragglers one by one. The results were catastrophic. On August 17, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched a raid against the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany. 230 B-17s took off. 60 never returned. That's a 26% loss rate. 600 men dead or captured in a single mission. 2 months later, they tried again. Another Schweinfurt raid. Another 60 bombers lost. After that, the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids into Germany. The losses were unsustainable. At that rate, every bomber crew would be dead or captured within 30 missions. The problem was escort fighters. The Allies had excellent short-range fighters, Spitfires, P-47 Thunderbolts, but they couldn't fly deep into Germany. The Spitfire had a combat radius of about 175 miles. The P-47, with its massive radial engine, could manage maybe 230 miles on a good day. Berlin was 580 miles from England. So the bombers flew alone, and they died alone. Allied commanders tried everything. They added more guns to the bombers. They developed new formations. They trained crews to fly tighter patterns. Nothing worked. The mathematics were brutal. Bombers without fighter escort were dead men flying. In late 1943, General Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, called a meeting of his top engineers and demanded a solution. He pounded his fist on the table and said, "I don't care how you do it. Build me a fighter that can fly to Berlin and back, or we lose this war." The solution was already being tested at airfields across England. It was called the P-51 Mustang. The P-51 Mustang was born from desperation and Anglo-American cooperation. In 1940, the British needed fighters immediately. They were fighting for survival during the Battle of Britain. They approached North American Aviation, a California-based company that had never built a fighter aircraft before, and asked if they could design and build one in 120 days. The chief designer, a brilliant engineer named Edgar Schmude, said yes. He worked around the clock. The design incorporated a revolutionary laminar flow wing that reduced drag and increased speed. The fuselage was sleek and aerodynamic. The aircraft was beautiful, all curves and purpose. The first prototype flew in October 1940, just 117 days after the design began. But there was a problem. The original engine, an American-made Allison V1710, was decent at low altitude but struggled above 15,000 feet. At the altitudes where bomber combat happened, 25,000 feet and higher, the Mustang was sluggish and underpowered. The British tested it and were disappointed. The performance wasn't good enough for high-altitude combat. Then someone had an idea. What if they replaced the Allison engine with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered the legendary Spitfire? In 1942, they tried it. They pulled the Allison out of a Mustang and bolted in a Merlin. The first test pilot to fly it climbed to 20,000 feet, pushed the throttle forward, and felt the aircraft leap forward like a racehorse given its head. The Mustang had been good, now it was extraordinary. The Merlin engine had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that compressed air and forced it into the cylinders, maintaining power even at extreme altitudes. At 25,000 feet, where other engines gasped and wheezed, the Merlin was still producing 1,490 horsepower. Top speed 440 miles per hour, ceiling 41,000 feet, climb rate 3,200 feet per minute. But the real breakthrough wasn't the speed, it was the range. The Mustang's laminar flow wing wasn't just aerodynamic, it was also large enough to hold massive internal fuel tanks. Combined with external drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, the P-51 could carry enough fuel to fly 1,000 miles, fight for 20 minutes, and fly 1,000 miles back. Suddenly, the impossible was possible. By February 1944, the 8th Air Force had 3 fighter groups equipped with P-51 Mustangs. They began flying escort missions deeper into Germany than ever before. German pilots noticed the new aircraft immediately. They were faster than anything the Luftwaffe had, and they seemed to be everywhere. But the Luftwaffe wasn't worried. Berlin was still beyond the range of any single-engine fighter. The capital was safe. Adolf Galland believed this completely. He was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Adolf Galland was 32 years old in March 1944, and he was already a legend. He had joined the Luftwaffe in 1934, learned to fly in gliders because the Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from having military aircraft, and then transferred to fighters when Hitler tore up the treaty and began rebuilding German air power. He flew in the Spanish Civil War, testing tactics and aircraft against Soviet-supplied Republican forces. He flew in Poland in 1939, in France in 1940, and in the Battle of Britain in 1940, where he shot down his first Spitfire over the English Channel. By 1941, he had 104 confirmed kills and a reputation as one of the deadliest fighter pilots in the world. He was also a brilliant tactician and a natural leader. In November 1941, he was promoted to General der Jagdflieger, General of Fighters, making him responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations across Europe. He was young, confident, and completely committed to defending Germany from Allied bombers. But by early 1944, cracks were appearing. The Americans were relentless. Every day, hundreds of bombers crossed into German airspace, hitting factories, rail yards, oil refineries. The Luftwaffe fought back with everything it had, but the losses were mounting. German pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Fuel was being rationed. Aircraft production was being disrupted by bombing raids on the very factories that built fighters. And now the Americans had a new fighter. Galland had read the intelligence reports. The P-51 Mustang was faster and more maneuverable than the Bf-109 or the FW-190. But he wasn't worried. Intelligence estimated there were maybe 150 Mustangs in England, a manageable number. And more importantly, they still couldn't reach Berlin. On the morning of March 6, 1944, Galland stood in the Luftwaffe operations room in Berlin, watching radar screens flicker with incoming contacts. It was just after noon. A junior officer approached and handed him a report. Herr General, 730 American bombers inbound from England. Estimated arrival over Berlin in 90 minutes. Galland nodded. Standard procedure. The bombers would fly deep into Germany, beyond the range of their escort fighters, and then his interceptors would strike. It had happened dozens of times before. He lit a cigar and waited. At 12:37 p.m., something appeared on the radar screens that made no sense. Small contacts, fast-moving, single-engine fighters. Flying beside the bombers. 60 miles west of Berlin. Galland stared at the screen. That was impossible. No single-engine fighter in the world had the range to fly from England to Berlin and back. The fuel requirements were insurmountable. The distance was too great. He called the radar operator over. "Are you certain those are fighters?" "Yes, Herr General. Single engine, escorting the bomber formations." Galland felt something cold settle in his stomach. If the Americans had solved the range problem, if they could escort bombers all the way to Berlin, then everything changed. The war in the air would be lost. He picked up the phone and called Derberitz Airfield. "Scramble every available fighter, all of them, now." 160 German fighters launched within minutes, Bf-109s and FW-190s from 3 fighter wings. They climbed hard toward the bomber stream, engines screaming, pilots tense and ready. The plan was simple. Ignore the escorts, break through to the bombers, destroy as many B-17s as possible. It had worked before. It wouldn't work today. At 1:05 p.m., the first German fighters reached the bomber stream 40 miles west of Berlin. Major Gunther Specht, commanding IIJG-11, led 32 Bf-109s in a classic head-on attack. The tactic was simple. Approach from 12 o'clock high, dive at maximum speed, fire a 3-second burst from 1,000 yards, then break away before the bomber gunners could track you. Specht had done this dozens of times. He was an experienced pilot with 17 kills. He knew exactly what to do. He pushed his stick forward and dove toward the lead B-17 formation, his fighter accelerating to 400 miles per hour. Around him, 31 other Bf-109s followed in a tight arrowhead formation. They were at 27,000 feet. The bombers were at 25,000 feet. Perfect. Specht armed his guns, one 20 cannon firing through the propeller hub, 2 13 machine guns in the nose cowling. His finger hovered over the trigger. 1,200 yards. 1,000 yards. And then the P-51s hit them. 8 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group dove out of the sun from 28,000 feet. They had a 3,000-foot altitude advantage and a 40-mile-per-hour speed advantage. They came down like hawks on rabbits. The lead Mustang, flown by Captain John England, locked onto a Bf-109 and fired a short burst. Tracers walked across the German fighter's left wing, punching through aluminum and fuel tanks. The Bf-109 erupted into flames and fell away, trailing black smoke. Speck's formation disintegrated. German fighters broke left and right, trying to evade, but the Mustangs were faster. In the next 90 seconds, the Americans shot down 4 Bf-109s and damaged 3 more. Speck himself survived only by diving away at full throttle, his engine screaming as he plunged toward the ground. When he finally leveled off at 10,000 feet, his formation was gone, scattered, destroyed. The bombers flew on untouched. At 1:18 p.m., Galland received the first loss reports in the operations room. 4 fighters down, 7 pilots missing, 0 bombers destroyed. He stared at the reports in disbelief. His interceptors were supposed to be unstoppable. The FW-190 was one of the best fighters in the world. The Bf-109 had been winning air battles since 1937. How were they losing? The answer was the engine. At 25,000 feet, the Packard Merlin engine in the P-51 produced 1,490 horsepower. The BMW 801 radial engine in the FW-190 produced 1,700 horsepower at sea level. At altitude, power dropped to barely 1,200 horsepower. The result, the FW-190 was 30 miles per hour slower than the Mustang, above 20,000 feet. The Bf-109 was even worse. Its Daimler-Benz DB605 engine produced 1,475 horsepower at sea level, but only 1,100 horsepower at altitude. Top speed, 386 miles per hour. The P-51 could outrun it, outclimb it, and outturn it. And there were so many of them. Galland's intelligence had estimated 150 Mustangs in England. The actual number was 238. And they were all over Berlin. At 1:40 p.m., Adolf Galland made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would see this for himself. He called Derberitz Airfield and ordered his personal FW-190A8 prepared for flight. Then he grabbed his flight gear, leather jacket, silk scarf, gloves, and drove the 15 miles from Luftwaffe headquarters at reckless speed. By 1:55 p.m., he was strapping into the cockpit. The FW-190A8 was one of the best fighters Germany had. 1,700 horsepower, 4 20 cannons, 2 13 machine guns, armor plating behind the seat. At low altitude, it could outfight anything the Allies had. But Galland knew the truth. At high altitude, it was outclassed. He didn't care. He needed to see the Americans for himself. He pushed the throttle forward, released the brakes, and roared down the runway. The FW-190 lifted into the air at 110 miles per hour, climbing steeply over the western suburbs of Berlin. The sky was full of contrails, white lines scratching across the blue, marking the paths of bombers and fighters at 25,000 feet. The radio was chaotic, filled with frantic German voices calling out enemy positions, warning of attacks, reporting losses. Galland climbed through 15,000 feet, then 18,000 feet, then 20,000 feet. His rate of climb was sluggish, barely 800 feet per minute. At sea level, the FW-190 could climb at 2,800 feet per minute, but up here, the BMW 801 engine was gasping for oxygen. At 22,000 feet, he leveled off and scanned the sky. And then he saw them. A formation of 36 B-17s, flying in tight defensive boxes, their contrails streaming behind them like chalk lines. They looked massive and slow, lumbering through the sky at 180 miles per hour. And above them, weaving back and forth in loose pairs, were the P-51s. They were silver, sleek, beautiful. They had checkered noses and black and white invasion stripes on their wings. Even from a distance, they looked fast. Galland counted them, 8, no 12, no 16. They were everywhere. He pushed the throttle forward and climbed toward the bombers. His plan was to make a single firing pass, just one, to see if he could break through the fighter screen. At 23,000 feet, 2 P-51s spotted him. They rolled inverted and dove, not directly at him, but in a wide, curving approach that would bring them onto his tail with a speed advantage. Galland recognized the tactic immediately. They were using their altitude and speed to dictate the engagement. They weren't chasing him. They were positioning themselves to kill him. He had no choice. He pushed the stick forward and dove away, accelerating toward the ground. The FW-190 shuddered as it passed 450 miles per hour, the controls stiffening, the airframe groaning under the stress. The P-51s followed, but they didn't press the attack. They had bombers to protect. They climbed back to their patrol altitude and resumed their weaving pattern. Galland leveled off at 18,000 feet and circled west of Berlin, breathing hard, his heart pounding. For the next 15 minutes, he watched the battle. He saw Bf-109s and FW-190s attempting to break through the fighter screen. He saw them shot down, one after another, by Mustangs that were faster, higher, and more numerous. He saw the bombers fly on, untouched, toward their targets in the heart of Berlin. At 2:38 p.m. he heard the first bombs fall, distant thunder rolling across the city, the Erkner ball-bearing plant, the Daimler-Benz factory at Genshagen. The Americans were hitting precision targets in broad daylight, 580 miles from their bases in England. And there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to stop them. Galland turned his FW-190 back toward Derberitz and landed at 2:55 p.m. He climbed out of the cockpit and stood on the tarmac, staring at the western sky. Around him, ground crews were refueling and rearming the few fighters that had survived. Pilots climbed out of their aircraft, shaken, exhausted, some of them wounded. A young lieutenant from JG-11 walked past Galland. The pilot's face was pale, his hands trembling. He looked at Galland and said, without being asked, "They're everywhere, Herr General. We can't get through. We can't even get close." Galland said nothing. He knew the pilot was right. By 3:30 p.m. the bombers were gone. They had turned west, back toward England, still escorted by P-51s. Some of the Mustangs were damaged, bullet holes in wings shattered canopies, but they kept flying. The Luftwaffe had launched 160 fighters to defend Berlin. 66 had been shot down. 29 pilots were dead, 18 were wounded, 19 were missing. The Americans had lost 11 bombers and 5 fighters. Galland returned to Luftwaffe headquarters and reviewed the loss reports. The numbers were catastrophic. In a single mission, the Luftwaffe had lost 41% of the fighters committed to the defense of Berlin. Replacement aircraft would take weeks. Replacement pilots, experienced pilots who could survive combat against the Americans, would take months to train. And the Americans would be back tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. What Galland understood, standing in that operations room on the afternoon of March 6, 1944, was that the air war over Germany was no longer a question of tactics or skill or courage. It was a question of mathematics. And the mathematics were hopeless. The United States was producing 2,000 P-51 Mustangs per month. Germany was producing 1,200 fighters per month, all types combined. The Americans were training 10,000 pilots per month. Germany was training 2,500. The Americans had 100-octane fuel in unlimited quantities. Germany was rationing 87-octane synthetic fuel made from coal. And now the Americans had solved the range problem. At 4:45 p.m., Galland received a telephone call from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was furious. He demanded to know why the Luftwaffe had failed to stop the raid. He accused Galland's pilots of cowardice. He insisted the P-51s over Berlin were a lie, a propaganda trick by the Americans. Galland interrupted him. "Herr Reichsmarschall, I saw them myself. I was in the air over Berlin. The P-51s are real. They have the range. They have the performance. And there are hundreds of them." Göring refused to believe it. Impossible. Single-engine fighters cannot fly from England to Berlin. The distance is too great. They're using drop tanks, Herr Reichsmarschall, external fuel tanks. They drop them when they engage our fighters. It gives them the range. There was a long silence on the line. Then Goering said quietly, "If what you're saying is true, then we have lost the air war." Galland closed his eyes. "Yes, Herr Reichsmarschall, we have." The line went dead. Galland sat in silence for a long time, staring at the reports on his desk. He thought about the young lieutenant who had said, "We can't get through." He thought about the 29 pilots who had died today. He thought about the silver Mustangs weaving patterns over Berlin, untouchable, unstoppable. And he knew with absolute certainty that Germany had lost. The P-51 Mustang was not a miracle weapon. It was the product of industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism, two things Germany could no longer match. The Packard Merlin engine was built in a factory in Detroit that covered 3.5 million square feet and employed 28,000 workers. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It produced 4,000 engines per month, each one identical to the last, each one producing exactly 1,490 horsepower at 25,000 feet. Germany's aero-engine production, by contrast, was scattered across dozens of small factories, many underground, many bombed repeatedly. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine was built by hand. Quality control was inconsistent. Power output varied. Some engines produced 1,475 horsepower. Others produced 1,300. Pilots never knew what they were getting. And Germany was running out of everything. Chromium for steel alloys, nickel for engine components, molybdenum for armor plate, rubber for tires, high-octane fuel for aircraft. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was rationing fuel so severely that new pilots received less than 100 hours of flight training before being sent into combat. American pilots received 400 hours. The result was predictable. German pilots were shot down on their first or second mission. The few veterans who survived, men like Galland, were outnumbered and exhausted. On March 8, 2 days after the Berlin raid, Galland met with Albert Speer, Germany's Minister of Armaments. Speer showed him the production figures for February 1944. Germany had produced 1,016 single-engine fighters. The Americans had produced 2,314 fighters, just P-51s and P-47s, not counting P-38s or naval aircraft. Speer said, "We cannot win a war of attrition against American industry. We don't have the resources, we don't have the factories, we don't have the time." Galland said, "Then what do we do?" Speer had no answer. Between March 6, 1944 and May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, the 8th Air Force flew 238 more missions over Germany. P-51 Mustangs escorted bombers to every major city: Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, Stuttgart, Cologne. They destroyed aircraft factories, oil refineries, rail yards, bridges. They shot down 4,950 German aircraft in air-to-air combat. The Luftwaffe never recovered from March 6, 1944. Pilot losses were unsustainable. Fuel shortages grounded entire fighter wings. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe could muster only 319 fighters to oppose the Allied invasion of Normandy. The Allies had 5,000 aircraft over the beaches. Galland continued to fight. In November 1944, after repeated clashes with Goering over Luftwaffe strategy, he was relieved of his command as General of Fighters. In January 1945, he formed Jagdverband 44, an elite unit flying the new Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262 was faster than any Allied aircraft, 540 miles per hour, but it came too late and in too few numbers. Germany produced 1,400 Me-262s. Only 200 saw combat. On April 26, 1945, Galland flew his last mission. He shot down a B-26 Marauder over Munich, his 104th and final kill. His knee was shattered by a .50 caliber bullet from a P-47 Thunderbolt. He crash-landed his Me-262 and was pulled from the wreckage by German soldiers. 12 days later, Germany surrendered. After the war, Galland was interviewed by American intelligence officers. They asked him when he knew Germany had lost the war. He answered without hesitation, "The day I saw P-51 Mustangs over Berlin." It wasn't the bombers that defeated Germany, it was the fighters escorting them. The bombers destroyed factories and cities, but the fighters destroyed the Luftwaffe. They shot down experienced pilots who could never be replaced. They forced Germany to scatter aircraft production into underground factories where quality control collapsed. They made it impossible for the Luftwaffe to concentrate its forces anywhere. And they did it with a combination of industrial capacity and engineering pragmatism that Germany could never match. The P-51 Mustang was not the best fighter of World War II in every category. The FW-190 had heavier armament. The Spitfire had a tighter turning radius. The Me-262 was faster. But the Mustang had something more important than any single performance characteristic. It had range, it had numbers, and it had an industrial base that could produce 15,000 of them in 3 years, while Germany struggled to build 30,000 fighters of all types in 6 years. On March 6, 1944, when Adolf Galland stood on the tarmac at Derberitz Airfield and watched the contrails fade over Berlin, he understood that the war was no longer about tactics or courage or even technology. It was about mathematics. And the mathematics were hopeless. The United States had outproduced, outtrained, and outengineered Germany. The P-51 Mustang over Berlin was simply the proof. The March 6, 1944 raid on Berlin marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. For the first time, American fighters had escorted bombers to the German capital and back, a round trip of 1,160 miles. The Luftwaffe lost 66 fighters that day. The Americans lost 11 bombers and 5 fighters. By May 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Germany itself. By June 1944, it had lost air superiority over France. By September 1944, it had effectively ceased to exist as a strategic force. The P-51 Mustang flew more combat sorties than any other Allied fighter in Europe, 213,873 missions. It destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air and 4,131 on the ground. It escorted bombers on every major raid from March 1944 until the end of the war. Adolf Galland survived the war. He lived until 1996, dying at the age of 83. In his memoirs he wrote, "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." The story you just heard is one of thousands from World War II, stories of courage, innovation, and the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare. Here at World War II Ember, we're dedicated to bringing you these forgotten histories, told with the depth and detail they deserve. If this story moved you, if you felt the cold fear in Lieutenant Howard's hands, the weight of defeat on Galland's shoulders, or the roar of those Merlin engines over Berlin, then do us a favor. Hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this story with more people who love history. Subscribe to World War II Ember so you never miss another deep dive into the battles, the machines, and the people who shaped our world. And drop a comment below. Tell us, what part of this story hit you hardest? What other World War II stories do you want us to cover? We read every single comment, and your feedback shapes what we create next. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. This is World War II Ember. Remember the embers, tell the stories.